Trip to Morocco, 1968. Travel by Happenstance, Part 2. In this part we travelled up the Atlantic coast to Tangier, before crossing back to Spain. After a look at Gibraltar, we hitchhiked along the Mediterranean coast, but stumbled across a fascinating narrow-gauge railway. The first step was Agadir to Essaouira. Essaouira was an attractive small town. It was very hot during the day, but once the sun went down it became surprisingly cold. There was no problem finding a hotel, but after looking at several we found that they were all damp. The only solution was to put on our anoraks, strip the bed down to the wire mesh, and use our sleeping bags plus a blanket that we'd bought in Fez. Not ideal, but we'd slept on worse, and at least we didn't have to chase rats away. This shows the port area, and this is a scenic part of the town. It has a busy fishing port. Essaouira was not as old as the other cities we visited. It was built under order of the Sultan between 1760 and 1770, and was originally intended as a military port, hence the defensive walls and forts. Agadir was in revolt, and the Sultan wanted a local base. Later it became an important commercial centre. During the 19th century it was the only Moroccan port south of Tangier that was open to European trade, and prospered accordingly. However, the development of Casablanca eventually led to its decline. It then made a good recovery as a fishing port and as a destination for tourism. One of Essaouira's claims to fame is as the location for most of Orson Welles' film Othello. The film was something of a crusade for Welles. He paid for most of the production himself, and also encouraged the crew to borrow from friends. There's a restored copy of the American version on YouTube. If you decide to watch this strange film, don't expect a travelogue. The shots are often short and taken from odd angles. There's very little dialogue, but the American version is provided with a commentary. After a day exploring, we took a bus to Casablanca. For many people, its claim to fame is the 1946 Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman film Casablanca. In 1968, it was the largest city in Morocco by far, with a population in the millions, and had a European feel. Originally, the French colonialists often built in Art Nouveau style. However, after the 1925 Paris Exposition des Arts Décoratifs, the style turned towards Art Deco. These show several buildings in the city. It didn't hold our attention for long, and after a couple of days we felt that it was time to move on, and boarded a bus for Rabat. When we arrived, the first thing that hit us was the awful smell, somewhere between rotting fish and sewage. How could a population put up with it? Perhaps after a bit they became desensitized and immune. The hotels that we could afford all suffered from the damp of the Atlantic coast. There seemed to be no escaping it, so a damp hotel it had to be. Since 1912, Rabat has been the capital, first of the French Protectorate, and then, since the country's independence in 1956, of the whole of Morocco. However, in 1968, in some ways it seemed like a small town. Everything seemed to shut down by 10 p.m. Much of the city was arranged on a modern grid structure, but there were still attractive areas. The tourist office said that we should visit the Cella. This was first inhabited about 2,000 years ago. For a time it was a thriving port, and one of the last to continue trade with the Roman Empire. Since it faces the Atlantic rather than the Mediterranean, this is rather surprising. In 1154 it was the first to proclaim Moulay Idris founder of the first Arab dynasty. The site is rather confusing, with Roman ruins, the remains of a mosque, and a royal burial ground. However, it's all very picturesque. The most recognisable elements are the gateway and the view of the minaret. It was eventually abandoned in favour of the unfortunately named town of Saleh, across the Bouregag River, once a haven for Barbary pirates. For many years it was more important than Rabat itself. We didn't visit Salé, so can't relate whether it lived up to its name. Salé, of course, is French for dirty. After Rabat, we decided to continue north by bus to Tangier. Waiting for the bus to arrive, we sat in a Super Corti Maggiore cafe area, an intriguing name that we'd first encountered in Italy. Feeling rather mean, we bought a single coffee and started to share it. However, the guy behind the counter assumed that we were deserving poor and poured us another one. For some reason, the bus driver also took a shine to us. He suggested we just buy tickets to Kenitra. He then gave us tickets from Kenitra to Tangier. Since it was only about 50 miles to Kenitra, and Kenitra to Tangier was about 200 miles, this was a significant saving. The 1946 film Tangier gives little introduction to the city, since none of it was shot on location. But at least the film gives an idea of the intrigue that existed there during World War II. We found a cheap hotel and were delighted to find it wasn't damp. The following day we set out to explore the city. The port zone was quite modern. As with the other Moroccan cities, there were two main areas, the Old Town and the Ville Nouvelle. However, there was also a strong alternative international feel. Many of the Beat generation had passed through, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Brian Gysin, etc. In 1954, William Burroughs arrived. He had just shot Joan Volmer in Mexico City, according to him, accidentally. Tangier's laid-back atmosphere and the easy availability of drugs were what he needed, and for the next 4 years he put together the writings that became the notorious novel The Naked Lunch. A good first edition of this book can cost over £1,000. This view shows the attractive polychromatic Sidi Bourbid Mosque, built in 1917 to honour Sheikh Sidi Bourbid, 926 to 1010, as a founder of a Sufi order. It overlooks the Grand Souk, known locally as the Grand Soko. We wandered through the old town looking for picturesque corners, gateways, and the souks. It was difficult to avoid would-be guides. Eventually the road called again. On our arrival in Morocco, we bypassed Tétouan, so rather than going direct to Ceuta, we diverted. Tétouan had been the capital of the Spanish Protectorate, and in 1968 still had many signs written in Spanish. You could hear quite a lot of Spanish being spoken, and very little French. It was not uncommon to see men wearing a fez. Unfortunately, I didn't take a photo, and I haven't been able to find one. However, I do have this rather good postcard image of men wearing a fez in Constantinople. Apart from the main mosque and the gateways, there was not a lot of architecture to see. This is the Sidi al-Baraka Mosque, and this the Reinsa Gateway. However, the old train station should not be missed. Originally it served narrow-gauge railways to Ceuta and Melilla, but the service terminated after the end of the Spanish Protectorate in 1956. It now houses the Museum of Modern Art. As usual, the souks were the most animated areas, and here are 3 pictures taken in the souk. There were lots of beggars around, some of whom were severely mutilated. We wondered how they survived, since we never saw anyone give them anything. After Tétouan, we returned via Ceuta and the ferry to Algeciras. Here we were lucky and found a good hotel. Gibraltar was close, so we decided to spend a day having a look at it. It's not an island, but the easiest method to get there was by boat. Spain had taken control of Gibraltar from the Moors and held it in 1704, when it was captured by the British during the War of the Spanish Succession. The Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, then ceded it to Britain in perpetuity. In recent times, Spain has tried to gain possession of it again. However, it's not so keen to give up Ceuta and Melilla. During World War II, Gibraltar was of great strategic importance, since it controlled the entrance to the Mediterranean. The town is all on the west side, and the east side is mostly devoted to rainwater capture. It was strange to hear English being spoken by people other than tourists, and to be using pounds, shillings and pence again. Main Street was rather quaint, with red telephone and post boxes. Shop names such as Lipton's and the Imperial News Agency gave it a feel of an outpost of the Empire, which of course it is. You could even get real fish and chips. To ensure authenticity, they brought the fish in specially from England. We spent some time in the excellent museum. The entry fee was 1 shilling and sixpence. The current entry fee is £15. Such is the effect of inflation. The next day we continued our journey. Hitchhiking along the Costa del Sol was nothing like as easy as in UK. There wasn't much traffic, and the cars were generally already full. Often as they sped by, they'd give us a wave or a rude sign. We made our way by a series of short lifts. Torremolinos had just started its march towards the Torremolinos of today that mass air travel has brought. This shows Torremolinos in 1968. And this, the Torremolinos of today. When we reached Motril, we made a diversion to Granada to see the Alhambra. It's a stunning example of Islamic architecture, a fortress and a palace, which although started in the 9th century was mostly built between 1238 and 1358 by Ibn al-Ahmad, the founder of the Moorish Nasrid dynasty, and his successors. It's built on a plateau and overlooks the city of Granada. It's arranged as a series of palaces, courtyards and gardens. The intricate decoration is made of a kind of stucco, primarily gypsum, a form of hydrated calcium sulfate. The 3 pictures here showing some examples. When we returned to the coast, it was getting late, so we decided to try sleeping on a beach. It turned out not to be so idyllic as it sounds. It became damp, and then a tribe of hopping insects came out. We closed our eyes and tried to ignore them. In the morning we got up early and went for a swim. We can't remember exactly where it was. However, we do remember that the sea was polluted, and after seeing various unmentionables floating by, we got out rather quickly. The hitchhiking went well, and we covered the 150 miles from Almeria to Alicante by about 2 p.m. Just after Alicante, we got a lift in a battered 2CV van. It had been used for carrying fish and stank of it. The driver delighted in slewing around the corners. Anyone who's travelled in a 2CV will remember its unusual swaying suspension. We soon had enough and asked to be let out. Walking along the road, we saw a narrow gauge railway. It had grass growing between the tracks and seemed abandoned. We decided this was another Happenstance, and we should walk along it. After a mile or 2 we came to a little station, and to our surprise there was a small group of people on the platform, and inquiries determined that there was a train due. It soon arrived. It was a type of rail car, and we were able to sit near the front and watch it part the vegetation. Where was it going? We didn't care. There were many stops. It was the classic slow train of literature. One of the stops was Benidorm. In 1968, like Torremolinos, it had started development. This is the Benidorm of 1968. Eventually, too soon for us, the railcar reached a terminus at Casablanca. There were engine sheds, various criss-crossing lines, and a small 060 steam locomotive, number 27. Unfortunately, the sun was behind it, and I didn't get a very good photograph. However, we were able to find a timetable for the narrow gauge route that we had taken. It listed all the 29 stops between Alicante and Casablanca. There was then a Spanish standard gauge connection to Valencia. Time was getting on, so we found ourselves a hotel. In the morning, looking at a map, there were 2 main possibilities for our return. We could head cross-country to Zaragoza and then skirt the edge of the Pyrenees to Irun, or we could keep to the coast and explore Barcelona before turning north through France. After some consideration, we decided that Barcelona deserved more time than we could spare, so should be left for another time. The reverse side of our timetable showed a tram omnibus service to Zaragoza. This was a cheap stopping service. It seemed ideal, and we handed over our pesetas. This postcard shows a typical tram omnibus or route near Pamplona. Pollution then was not taken so seriously. From Zaragoza we took another omnibus to Irun. In preparation of this video I decided to research the narrow gauge railway that we travelled on. There were several books on eBay, but the most relevant one seemed to be Minor Railways and Tramways in Eastern Spain, published by the Birmingham Locomotive Club in 1963. There was a copy on eBay. Unfortunately, it was priced at £53 plus postage from Germany. Rather too expensive for me. However, I was eventually able to trace a copy in Felixstowe for £12. Although it had only 60 pages, it turned out to be a mine of information. It contained a map of the lines, and together with my 1968 timetable, I was able to identify the route. It described the history of the lines in detail. Apparently the part that we travelled, from Tangier to Casablanca, was the first narrow gauge railway in Spain, opened in 1864, and originally used animal traction, probably mules. Parts of the track had belonged to various owners, but in the 1960s the whole route from Alicante to Casablanca became served by railcar. The book lists all the locomotives used on the route and their reference numbers. The steam loco in my photo carried the number 27, which via the book identifies it as an 060 built by the Société Franco-Belge de Matériel de Chemin de Fer. Looking up this company on the internet provides more information. I was also able to find an excellent photo of loco number 25, which looks identical. This photo is copyright as part of Ernie's Extension Railway Archive. I wasn't able to trace his contact details to obtain permission to include it, but if you want to see it, a Google search will pull it up. Initially I thought number 25 was used on a different route, since it said Tangier to Casablanca, rather than Tangier to Casablanca. However, I then discovered that Casablanca is the Valencian name for Casablanca. The Valencian language is considered to be a form of Catalan. The railcar was built by Bullard, a Spanish company. I was able to contact the Industrial Railway Society, who took over the Birmingham Locomotive Club. They kindly gave me permission to use this copyright route map and provided further information. The narrow gauge tracks are shown by the thicker lines. The train journey through France was just a reversal of our arrival, except that this time the channel port was Calais. As we neared Calais, we suddenly realised that we'd not spent the specified time in France for our low-cost tickets. If they checked our passports, we might have to pay a fine. So the solution was to jump off the train. Remembering the autobiography of a supertramp, this was not without risk. W. H. Davies had lost a foot on such an escapade, and my own grandfather had at age 19 lost all the fingers of his right hand when run over by a locomotive. Even so, as the train began its entry to Calais, we opened a door and, throwing out our rucksacks, jumped off. It was a success, and pleased with our daring, we walked on to the ferry port. Jumping off a train would be something we would later bore our children about. Before I close this video, perhaps I should mention some of the other travel books that we have acquired over the years, and which have significantly influenced our wish to travel. There are too many to list, but if you pause these shots, you should be able to read some of the titles and authors. There are shots of 3 shelves: Shelf 1, Shelf 2 and Shelf 3. One of our favourites, held on a different shelf, is Sir Orlstein's Serindia, Volume 4, The Plates, published in 1921, from his detailed report of exploration in Central Asia and westernmost China. It has some beautiful reproductions of Buddhist frescoes that he discovered in a set of caves. We found our copy smouldering on an undeveloped bomb site in the East End of London in the 1960s. This photo shows the cover, and the next 3 photos show some illustrations from inside. As you can see, many of the illustrations are mostly complete. However, the fire made the paper very brittle, so that every time you open the book, tiny fragments break away. Somehow, given the topic, this seems appropriate. This is normally a very expensive book. As I write, there's a first edition set of the full 5 volumes on AB Books in very good condition, for £28,878.51, plus shipping from Japan. Even a modern reprint is over £300. Apparently the print run of the 1921 edition was only 500 copies. However, don't worry, there's now a free downloadable version on the internet. This is almost the end of our Morocco video. However, for those of you who watched part 1, I found this photo of the destruction of the Beatnik Wall in St Ives. This really is the end of part 2 and the end of the video.